There is no character in The Hobbit who embodies the moral complexity of the wild more thoroughly than Beorn does. On the one hand, Beorn is extremely dangerous and unpredictable. Gandalf first refers to him rather ominously as an unnamed somebody. We learn that this somebody lives close by and that he carved the steps out of the huge rock they're standing on, and that it would be very dangerous to encounter him at night. Gandalf calls him a very great person, which is not particularly reassuring, especially when Gandalf follows that statement by insisting that they must be careful not to annoy him, or heaven knows what will happen. That opening quote comes to us this week from Professor Corey Olsen's Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, which is an excellent book, very highly recommended, and it's a pleasure to read from a physical book here right at the beginning of the podcast. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, Chapter 7 of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, Queer Lodgings, in which Bilbo and the dwarves spend a couple of days in the strangest Airbnb this side of the Misty Mountains. I guess technically the other side of the Misty Mountains. I would naturally position myself to the west of the Misty Mountains, given the choice. I would rather be in the west than the wild, but, there's probably more to be made of that. We're being joined here live by Andrea and by Brian. Good to have you both with me this evening. It's going to be a really interesting discussion because I mentioned in last week's session that this is not my favorite part of the book, right? Beorn is not my favorite character in the book, in fact, but upon exercising this careful piece of close reading, right, upon really delving into this chapter, I just kept finding more and more and more to talk about, which is why I'm going to move pretty quickly into this week's reading, because I have a surprising number of slides and a surprisingly disparate number of points to make, I suppose. We're going to be talking about courtesy, and we're going to be talking about the conventions of polite society and exactly what that means here when we are so carefully positioned beyond the boundaries of polite society. We're also going to be talking a little bit about the way that Beorn and Beorn's house, the experience, the Beorn experience, capital B, capital E, is reflective both of the beginning of The Hobbit and the middle of The Lord of the Rings. We're going to be talking about how Beorn kind of is co-positioned as a mediating point between the West and the Wild, right? Between, I guess not even between the West and the Wild, between the hill and the mountain would be a better way of putting that, I think. We're going to have a lot... Andrea's already calling out. Andrea has already, as is her way, jumped to the crux of the matter here, because those animals are the weirdest thing in this book. Yes, they are. Yes, they are, and I'm kind of at a loss to explain them. But we're going to delve into it, beginning as we must with the farewell to the eagles and the beginning of the chapter. Let me call up our first slide for the evening. "Farewell," they cried. "Wherever you fare to, your eyries receive you at journey's end." That is the polite thing to say among eagles. "May the wind under your wings bear you where the sun sails and the moon walks," answered Gandalf, who knew the correct reply. And so they parted. And though the Lord of the Eagles became in after days the king of all birds and wore a golden crown and his 15 chieftains' golden collars made of the gold that the dwarves gave them, Bilbo never saw them again, except high and far off in the battle of 5 armies. But as that comes in at the end of this tale, we will say no more about it just now. An expert bit of foreshadowing there, just to line us up for the Battle of 5 Armies at the end of the book. A quick note here, just to clarify, this is not the same Lord of the Eagles who will be so instrumental at the end of The Lord of the Rings. This is not Gwaihir. We know this for sure because in The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf thanks Gwaihir for rescuing him twice, which would be the rescue from Orthanc as Gandalf the Grey and the rescue from Zirak Zagil as Gandalf the White following the battle with the Balrog. So this is a different Lord of all birds, as will be. And I'm really interested in how in this moment, on the threshold of Beorn's house, we are, metaphorically, right, narratively, not perhaps literally at this point, we are throwing forward to the end of the book. We're throwing forward to the conclusion of all things. We've just been told that the dwarves are going to get their gold. We have just been reassured that the dwarven, I was going to say conquest, but I guess recapture of Erebor is going to be successful, and they are going to honor their promise to bestow gold upon the eagles. And again, that reference to the Battle of 5 Armies right at the end of the book, also foreshadowing that though we are now assured of their victory, the path there will not be so easy. Gandalf announces... Oh, the other thing that I really wanted to call out here too, my notes are in a little bit of disarray. It's been a busy day here, so my notes are a little bit more scattershot than usual, so forgive me if I'm kind of bouncing around from topic to topic a little more than usual. The other thing that I wanted to call out explicitly here is, of course, the introduction here at the beginning of Chapter 7 of the importance of courtesy. It's important that Gandalf knows the right thing to say, right? This is the polite thing to say among eagles. The eagles are giving the courteous kind of call and response, as we might see it here. And Gandalf knows the correct response. He's kind of confirming their social pact. He's confirming their relationship, and in so doing, affirming their kind of societal social relationship, right? He's acknowledging that there are conventions of shared culture between them, the one and the other. So we're going to continue to see courtesy, politeness, societal convention be extremely important through the rest of this chapter, but also be unexpectedly dismissed in certain ways. We're going to see that there is an important courtesy at play, an important sense of etiquette at play as we move through our encounter with Beorn, but it's not quite the etiquette that we might expect from, well, I was going to say the West, but of course we're also really folding the dwarves in here too. Beorn is an individual, and we'll talk about that more when we are finally introduced to him. First, we have to get to the Carrack and see where we are now. "And why is it called the Carrack?" asked Bilbo as he went along at the wizard's side. "He called it the Carrack because Carrack is his word for it. He calls things like that Carracks, and this one is the Carrack because it is the only one near his home, and he knows it well." "Who calls it? Who knows it?" "The somebody I spoke of. A very great person. You must all be very polite when I introduce you. I shall introduce you slowly, 2 by 2, I think, and you must be careful not to annoy him, or heaven knows what will happen. He can be appalling when he is angry, though he is kind enough if humoured. Still, I warn you, he gets angry easily." The dwarves all gathered round when they heard the wizard talking like this to Bilbo. "Is that the person you're taking us to now?" they asked. "Couldn't you find someone more easy-tempered? Hadn't you better explain it all a bit clearer?" and so on. "Yes, it is. It certainly is. No, I could not, and I was explaining very carefully," answered the wizard crossly. "If you must know more, his name is Beorn. He is very strong, and he is a skin changer." "What? A furrier? A man that calls rabbits conies when he doesn't turn their skins into squirrels?" asked Bilbo. It's... I'm tempted, of course, to start with the ending and work backward. This is a weird bit of social commentary. This is a weird bit of almost social satire, because we are deep in the British class hierarchy of the early 20th century here. Who calls rabbits conies? Well, we know from the estimable Sam Gamgee that the working classes call rabbits conies. Here Bilbo is really kind of showing off his upper middle class, if not lower upper class position in the society of the Shire, because he's being immediately judgmental to this kind of working man, to this furrier, this guy who skins and makes things from the skins also of woodland creatures, woodland animals. What's happening here, more importantly, I guess we should acknowledge here the carrack, right? A carrack is a kind of, an eight is the Old English word for it, right? Spelled E-Y-O-T. It's a sedimentary island in the middle of a river. Eight comes from the Old English word for small island, predictably enough, and carrack seems to be derived from carrig on the one hand, right? A Welsh word, carrig, combined with the Old English word for rock, which is happily just rock. Thus, carrack means rock, which leans into the idea of this little linguistic joke that Tolkien is making, having Beorn name things not just as the Anglo-Saxons named things, right? Very often, very literally, very bluntly, very directly, but as Tolkien also names things within Middle-earth. I really love how we're foreshadowing these things, how we're really looking at this threshold. It's another threshold, right? And it's tempting to see, this is going to be part of our construction this evening, is kind of looking at the ways in which Beorn is presented as simply another threshold, another bead on this string of picaresque adventures across Middle-earth, all the way to the Lonely Mountain. But Beorn is so carefully positioned and so weird within the schematic of Middle-earth that there are clearly other things happening here. And part of this introduction, of course, is that Beorn is unlike any other creature we have seen. He is very strong, and he is a skin changer. But also, he's clearly very connected to the world around him. He calls these things carracks. That's another interesting point of distinction there, right? It's not the men of the Vale of Anduin call these things carracks. It's not that the Northmen or even the men of Gondor, right? The low man of the post-Númenórean era call these things carracks. Beorn calls them carracks, and he calls this one the carrack because it's the one that's right here. It's the one that is closest to him, which is really, really interesting. Brian's calling out the professor again, introducing spoilers into the text, and Rachel saying, I like that. I wonder if someone did it before or if he was the first. I mean, it is a very... What we have to remember in terms of those kinds of narrative tricks, what we have to remember is that Tolkien is really, for all of his literary skill, is really drawing on a medieval tradition that is primarily oral, right? These stories, are told and retold, drawing on this oral tradition until they are captured, until they are fixed in a fleeting moment in the early medieval period into the middle medieval period. So he's drawing on the idea of a familiarity. In that tradition, you're rarely going to be told a new story, right? And if you are hearing a story for the first time, that's okay, because the people you are hearing it with, the people in your Beornian mead hall, are going to already be familiar with it. So calling ahead to the end of stories, positioning the narrative like above the text, and leveraging that kind of sense of dramatic irony, right? Positioning the audience as being knowledgeable, as possessing information that is going to be significant at the end of the story, even if it undercuts the tension within the story. That is all a part of that kind of medieval narrative tradition. That, I hesitate to say narrative there in quite the modern sense, but a medieval storytelling tradition, which is, of course, completely apposite, because that's what we're going to get from Beorn. That is going to be the trick that Gandalf plays, is exercising the power of storytelling at its most effective within the pages of this book. We're going to see Gandalf tell a story within a story that is going to so compel Beorn that he is going to be more open, more accessible. He's going to experience in microcosm, I suppose, the rewards of fairy stories, right? He's going to experience kind of recovery and escapism and consolation. All the rewards which Tolkien teaches us are part of the fairy tale template in his essay on fairy stories. So let's get into that. In fact, is there anything else that I wanted to call out? I wanted to call out the bees a little bit, because I think the bees are just genuinely delightful, honestly. I really like that we're encountering these gigantic bees as big as hornets. Hornets are not very big. Hornets are like 2 inches long, which is pretty big for a bee. But I think that what Tolkien is trying to communicate here is that these are the large, lazy, bumblebees that you find in the Midlands of England and all across the British Isles, really, like large and round and slow and generally pretty harmless. They're pretty genial, but just a little outsized. Certainly nothing prepares us for the scale of Beorn. Brian's asking, I wonder if there's a connection between Beorn and the polar bear character from the Father Christmas letters. Yes, this is so interesting, because Beorn, again, I'm hesitating to make a declarative statement. Beorn might be the element of Tolkien's Hobbit in particular, of this book in particular, that is the most drawn from like extra textual sources, because it's not that he's terribly specific. It's not that he's, it's not like Tom Bombadil, right? There isn't a raggedy doll kicking around the Tolkien house in the early 1930s from which he draws inspiration to create the figure of Tom Bombadil. This is something a little bit different. There's a kind of a shared pool of inspiration for Beorn. But let's get into that. Let's look at our first appearance of Beorn himself. And, well, God, note a few things. There's quite a lot happening on this slide. I must pass back to this slide so that you can see it too. In the middle, there was lying a great oak trunk with many lopped branches beside it. Standing near was a huge man with a thick black beard and hair and great bare arms and legs with knotted muscles. He was clothed in a tunic of wool down to his knees and was leaning on a large axe. The horses were standing by him with their noses at his shoulder. "Ah, here they are," he said to the horses. "You don't look dangerous. You can be off." He laughed a great rolling laugh, put down his axe, and came forward. "Who are you, and what do you want?" he asked gruffly, standing in front of them and towering tall above Gandalf. As for Bilbo, he could easily have trotted through his legs without ducking his head to miss the fringe of the man's brown tunic. "I am Gandalf," said the wizard. "Never heard of him," growled the man. "And what's this little fellow?" he said, stooping down to frown at the hobbit with his bushy black eyebrows. "That is Mr. Baggins, a hobbit of good family and unimpeachable reputation," said Gandalf. Bilbo bowed. He had no hat to take off and was painfully conscious of his many missing buttons. "I am a wizard," continued Gandalf. "I have heard of you if you have not heard of me, but perhaps you have heard of my good cousin Radagast, who lives near the southern borders of Mirkwood." So, the first appearance of Beorn in the writing of The Hobbit comes in the second phase of composition. Tolkien's obviously drawing on all of these Anglo-Saxon and Old English inspirations, as evidenced by the design of Beorn's mead hall and even his name, right? Beorn means bear in Old English, but it is then taken during that period to euphemistically mean a powerful warrior. It is used in a very kind of martial, heroic sense. The name Beowulf, a character very close to Tolkien's heart, obviously, is also sometimes translated as bear. Beorn was originally called, in the first draft of this chapter, Medved, a Slavic word, also meaning bear. So we're really like drawing these connections of a burly, powerful, outsized warrior from various traditions across Europe. It has been suggested, too, that his... Oh no, we're getting into the animals already. I don't want to spend this entire week talking about the animals, but it's really tempting to talk about the animals. It has been suggested that his connections with the animals with which he cohabitates, I don't want to say owns because I don't think that's the right relationship, right? But he lives with these animals. And that may be drawn, weirdly, from the Hugh Lofton books in the Dr. Dolittle series, which began in 1920 and are very popular with the Tolkien children all throughout their childhoods. There are 15 Dr. Dolittle books in total, all dedicated to the adventures of the eponymous doctor who possesses, if you're not familiar, the unusual gift of being able to talk to animals. The series has the dubious distinction of inspiring movies in 1967, 1998, 2001, 2006, 2008, 2009, and 2020, none of which are in any way good. I am not a Dr. Dolittle guy, I guess. I guess there is still some affection for the Rex Harrison one, right? I think that the 67 probably has some affection. I don't know. I am exactly the wrong age to know if Eddie Murphy is any good in those movies at all, or if those movies have any substance. So we're going to be talking about Beorn and who he is, but I think we have to acknowledge first a greater and perhaps more elusive question, right? What is he? In letter 144, written to Naomi Mitchison, Tolkien writes, quote, "Though a skin changer and no doubt a bit of a magician, Beorn was a man," capital M, end quote. This, we should note, is in the context of explaining why Beorn isn't in The Lord of the Rings, right? The point that Tolkien is making here is that Beorn has died of old age in the interim, but that doesn't explain the shapeshifting. If he's a man, at least as much as Bilbo is a man, the hobbits are an offshoot of mannish culture and mannish physiology, and certainly seem to possess the souls of men, right? If Beorn is a man, how do we explain his shapeshifting? And the first answer that I think we get from a lot of readers is that we simply don't. That Beorn is one of one. That Beorn is just this weird outlier in The Hobbit in much the same way as some people are inclined to read Tom Bombadil in the pages of The Lord of the Rings. But there are roots here within the characterization of Beorn which go deeper than that, right? We get this glimpse of him looking back to the mountains as relayed by Gandalf, right? This romantic figure looking back at the mountains, kind of promising himself that when the goblins are done, he will take his homeland back. Paran, we never get another mention of his homeland. That side of the story just seems to drop out completely. After the Battle of Five Armies, he is going to come back to his home here, and he is going to gather around him a culture, right? There are going to be Beornings in the years to come, but whatever land he's referring to, either within or on the other side of the Misty Mountains, it does not come up again. It's not terribly significant again. So how does Beorn change shape? And I'm not asking this in like a YouTube explanatory video of here's how we figured out what's happening under the surface of the Hobbit. It's more in a kind of cosmological sense, right? What kind of creature is Beorn that he can change shape? Because there is a type of creature that we know that inhabits Middle-earth that can change shape. We know that Maiar can change shape, right? So it is possible that Beorn might be descended from some kind of romance, a union between a Maya and a man, not unlike the union of Thingol and Melian that leads us to Luthien Tenuvial, right? Perhaps some follower of Orome the Hunter, or an adherent of Yavanna out here in the wilds of Middle-earth, right? Untold in the Silmarillion, because the Silmarillion is a story primarily, exclusively, basically, concerned with the lives of elves and the history of elves. Somewhere out here in the wilds of Middle-earth, before the elves come back, one of the Maiar hook up with a dude, and then we get a race of people who can change shape. And that is not, I think, a particularly satisfying explanation, not least of all because it invokes one of my least favorite tropes, which is just assuming that a Maiar did it, right? Assuming it is the like Tolkienian step up to a wizard did it, is just, oh no, an angelic demigod did it here in Middle-earth. Particularly because I think that there is a much better and tighter and closer explanation that involves here the introduction of Radagast of Rhosgobel. Radagast is an interesting figure. We're not really going to have an opportunity to talk much more about him, sadly, but he is an elusive figure within this phase of Tolkien's Legendarium, and really within all phases of Tolkien's Legendarium, honestly. He never really gets fully developed. His name even is not glossed by Tolkien. And Tolkien, in fact, specifically says that the meaning of his name has been lost to time, which didn't stop a great number of Tolkien scholars trying to unpick it, trying to get to the heart of that curious name. But what we do know is that Radagast is one of the Astari. He is one of the wizards. He comes to Middle-earth at the same time as Gandalf and Saruman and the Blue Wizards who go off into the east. But unlike Gandalf, he doesn't like to travel so much. He's not interested in the workings of the societies of man or the society of the hobbits, come to that. He settles down and instead falls in love with the flora and the fauna of Middle-earth. And he settles in Rosgobel. We don't exactly know when, but we can be pretty sure that he is there for a good long time, which isn't very far from Beorn's home. It's just, as Gandalf says here, on the southern tip of the Mirkwood. In the Council of Elrond, then, in the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf says this: Radagast is, of course, a worthy wizard, a master of shapes and changes of hue, and he has much lore of herbs and beasts, and birds are especially his friends. A master of shapes and changes of hue really makes me wonder if Radagast has, on the one hand, kind of preserved his own ability to change his form, right? All Istari are Maiar originally, and they are kind of preserved in the forms that we know them in when they come to Middle-earth. But it is possible that Radagast either remembered how to change his own form, maintain that power, or he taught a similar power to Beorn's ancestors. You know, the wizards have been in Middle-earth for almost 2,000 years, and because we are told that Radagast doesn't like to travel, he may have been living in Rosgobel for quite a while, and may indeed be the source of Beorn's shape-shifting power. And here, I kind of have to take all of that, everything I just said, kind of offering this explanation, and set it to one side, because what Beorn really is this Anglo-Saxon warrior figure. He is the bear, right? He is not the Chicago one, not the TV one, but like the older one with like a gigantic axe, who is clearly... I mean, we're told that Bilbo can pass under the hem of his tunic without stooping, without ducking. So he has to be 9 feet tall, maybe 10 feet tall, right? Towering even over Gandalf, as we're told here. So the positioning of Beorn within the schematic of Middle-earth, as we understand it, is difficult. And it's made all the more difficult, of course, by the animals which accompany Beorn, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Let's get into the story then, and I should frame this out just a little because we are going to, of course, be making some assumptions here as we move in, that we're thinking of Bag End, we're thinking of the first encounter, we're thinking of the unexpected party, we're thinking of Gandalf pulling that, well, not the same trick, but a variation certainly on that same trick, right? We've got the introduction of the dwarves, first one at a time and then in pairs, and then Gandalf shows up right at the end in the unexpected party. And now here we're kind of inverting that by having Gandalf and Bilbo going in, hooking Beorn with the story, which is the different element. That is the element that is distinct from the unexpected party. The dwarves don't come in and start telling their story. They carefully reserve their story until Thorin is present and then start relating it, right? Bilbo is left... well, I guess we don't need to hook Bilbo so much because he's not as dangerous as Beorn is. So here we have Gandalf and Bilbo going in. They start their story. Let me see. I've got the beginning of the story here. We're not going to do every iteration of the story, as charming as it is, but we have to at least begin here. I was coming over the mountains with a friend or two, said the wizard. Or two. I can only see one, and a little one at that, said Beorn. Well, to tell you the truth, I did not like to bother you with a lot of us until I found out if you were busy. I will give a call if I may. Go on, call away. So Gandalf gave a long, shrill whistle, and presently Thorin and Dori came round the house by the garden path and stood bowing low before them. 1 or 3 you meant, I see, said Beorn. But these aren't hobbits, they are dwarves. Thorin Oakenshield, at your service. Dori, at your service, said the 2 dwarves, bowing again. I don't need your service, thank you, said Beorn, but I expect you need mine. I am not over fond of dwarves, but if it is true you are Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thror, I believe, and that your companion is respectable, and that you are enemies of goblins and are not up to any mischief in my lands, what are you up to, by the way? And there we see, what are you up to, by the way, right? The story has its hooks in him. He is compelled to set aside his natural reluctance for society, right? Not naturally a gregarious figure is Beorn, but here he's willing to go along with it just to get to the tale. Though we'll see that there is still courtesy here. He's not polite in the way that the dwarves are polite. He's not polite in the way that Bilbo is polite. And we should observe, right, now with more context, with more perspective on the hill all the way to the west, we can see that actually the dwarves and the hobbits share a very a common sense of courtesy and etiquette, right? For all that the dwarves seem outrageous, they are much more like hobbits during the unexpected party than Beorn would be, for example. So this story, and this gambit by Gandalf introduces the notion of the dwarves as Beorn says here, a fine comic troupe, right? Troupe was right, he said, a fine comic one. I'm aware that my voice is for Beorn is kind of drifting toward, Geralt of Rivia. I don't know if you guys have been playing or have been watching The Witcher, but I'm kind of leaning in that direction for some reason, which I guess is not ill-suited entirely to Beorn, but I've just made myself aware of it, and now it's all that I can think of. So we're seeing, as I say, the kind of the inversion of the Bag End Gambit here in the house of Beorn, although we're still leaning on this idea, as I say, of civility. And you'll note that Beorn, for all that he is individualistic, for all that he is somewhat iconoclastic, right? For all that he is not bound by that same sense of shared society in particular, he's not ignorant. He's not unfamiliar with the movings of the world. He recognizes Thorin's name. He doesn't apparently recognize Thorin. If he recognized Thorin personally, he wouldn't say, but if it is true that you are Thorin, right? He recognizes the name and the lineage. He is schooled a little here, right? He has a sense of, I guess, recent history, right? Local politics. He has a sense of how the world is operating outside of his very small, very limited domain here. I do not need your service, thank you, but I expect you need mine. If you are Thorin, and your companion is respectable, and you are enemies of goblins, and are not up to mischief in my lands, and here very clearly, very, very deftly, Beorn gives us this kind of this schematic of societal expectation, right? What makes you acceptable? What makes you decent enough that I can offer you food, that I can offer you shelter? It is these things. If it is true that you are Thorin and your companion is respectable, right? I take that to mean if you are Thorin and therefore respectable because you are, the prince, the king in exile, in effect, of the dwarves, and your companion is similarly respectable, and you are enemies of goblins, and you are not up to mischief. That's it. And you can see the positioning of the goblins there, right? So high on his list. He's really focused on the anti-goblin sentiment. Let's move on and celebrate Gandalf's cleverness here with the successful execution of the plan. Excuse me. Mr. Baggins saw then how clever Gandalf had been. The interruptions had really made Beorn more interested in the story, and the story had kept him from sending the dwarves off at once like suspicious beggars. He never invited people into his house if he could help it. He had very few friends, and they lived a good way away, and he never invited more than a couple of these to his house at a time. Now he had got 15 strangers sitting in his porch. By the time the wizard had finished his tale and had told of the eagle's rescue and how they had all been brought to the Carrick, the sun had fallen behind the peaks of the misty mountains, and the shadows were long in Beorn's garden. "A very good tale," he said. "The best I've heard for a long while. If all beggars could tell such a good one, they might find me kinder. You may be making it all up, of course, but you deserve a supper for the story all the same. Let's have something to eat." "Yes, please," they all said together. "Thank you very much." And we're seeing how we're emphasizing this civility, right? We're emphasizing this decency through the use of Bilbo's formal name there at the beginning of this passage. Mr. Baggins saw then how clever Gandalf had been. He's feeling himself to be Mr. Baggins for maybe the first time since leaving the Shire, maybe the first time since passing Bree, maybe the first time since walking out of his front door without a handkerchief, right? You can imagine that he's not feeling terribly Mr. Bagginsy as he's riding along on his pony in a borrowed hood. What we're seeing here, in addition to this emphasis being put on civility, or I guess through the emphasis that is being put on civility, stands at odds with the way that the wild has been presented to us thus far, right? We have this idea that we leave the Shire and the landscape that we're traveling through is populated by, these brooding ruins on the hillsides and this sense of distance and of danger. It doesn't feel like home to Bilbo, but the very presence of those castles on the hillsides themselves tell us that there is society here. Those castles were constructed by the king or by the forces of the king. Andrea is saying in the chat here, "I love the juxtaposition of this wild person being so civilized." Absolutely. I think that is fantastic and so unexpected. And also, crucially, that he is not civilized by their standards. He is very much civilized by his own standards, right? Which is something that I think we're going to see, or maybe something we're going to be able to interrogate in a couple of weeks' time when we get properly into the woodland realm. This positioning of the wild as being a different kind of civil, I really do think speaks to Tolkien's fondness for and love of diversity, of the unexpected. There are things out there that are not like home, and home is good and special and maybe the best place for being. But we have to encounter the other perspectives on the world in order to fully appreciate it. I've been thinking so much lately about the importance of the scouring of the Shire, the importance of the return to the Shire, the importance of maintaining those stories and the stories of the War of the Ring in general, so that the people who live in the Shire can be grateful for the Shire that they have. Not that they can be, exploited, not that they can be satisfied with having less. The Shire is, after the War of the Ring, arguably more of a utopian idyll than it was before the War of the Ring, particularly once, King Alisar expands its boundaries all the way to the White Towers. But that idea of knowing the world so that you can be grateful for what you have and where you are, I think is very, very Tolkienian, honestly. Okay, I've put it off for as long as I can. We're almost halfway through a session. Let's get to our our talking animals. Why not? Inside the hall, it was now quite dark. Beorn clapped his hands and in-trotted 4 beautiful white ponies and several large, long-bodied grey dogs. Beorn said something to them in a queer language like animal noises turned into talk. They went out again and soon came back carrying torches in their mouths, which they lit at the fire and stuck in low brackets on the pillars of the hall about the central hearth. The dogs could stand on their hind legs when they wished and carry things with their forefeet. Quickly they got out boards and trestles from the side walls and set them up near the fire. Then, ba-ah, ba-ah, ba-ah was heard, and in came some snow-white sheep led by a large coal-black ram. One bore a white cloth embroidered at the edges with figures of animals. Others bore on their broad backs, trays with bowls and platters and knives and wooden spoons, which the dogs took and quickly laid on the trestle tables. These were very low enough even for Bilbo to sit at comfortably. Beside them, a pony pushed 2 low-seated benches with wide rush bottoms and the little short, thick legs for Gandalf and Thorin, which at the far end he put, while at the far end he put Beorn's big black chair of the same sort in which he sat with his great legs stuck far out under the table. These were all the chairs he had in his hall, and he probably had them low like the tables for the convenience of the wonderful animals that waited on him. What did the rest sit on? They were not forgotten. The other ponies came in rolling round drum-shaped sections of logs, smooth and polished and low enough even for Bilbo. So soon they were all seated at Beorn's table, and the hall had not seen such a gathering for many a year. So it is not just the case that these animals are in the employ of Beorn, or worse, that he is, the master of these animals, because we see that they are welcome at his table. And the positioning of Beorn's hall as very much, like all of the architectural description that we get here is exactly like the Anglo-Saxon meat hall, the kind of archetypal Anglo-Saxon meat hall, which is a place of conviviality. It is a place of society. Beorn isn't excluded from society. He just has his own. It is not like the elves of Rivendell or the hobbits of the Shire or the men of Gondor. It is a completely distinct kind of society. But these animals are being treated, well, almost something like peers, which is weird. It is strange, not just because they are unique, effectively, right? In the Legendarium, at least, and almost unique in his work in general, but because they are much more anthropomorphic. They are much more human-like than the other animals that we have seen. And Tolkien obviously esteems animals, right? There are many significant animal characters throughout the whole Legendarium, and those characters are presented as being worthy of respect on their own terms, not by how human they are, not by how like the reader of the book they are, but by how virtuous they are on their own terms. And the people that we credit as being good people meet those animals where they are, right? I'm thinking here of Shadowfax, right? Gandalf's relationship with Shadowfax is a testament to the goodness of Gandalf. Sam's relationship with Bill the Pony is a testament to the goodness of Sam. The eagles themselves, right? We can extend this to Huon the Hound of Valinor, who, apart from his supernatural ability to speak 3 times before his death, is just a super good and faithful dog, but a dog nonetheless. But the residents of the Mead Hall are weird. They aren't fully anthropomorphic, right? We don't go all the way to Peter Rabbit or Mr. and Mrs. Beaver from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or Zootopia. They're not that close to being humans in animal form, but they are closer to human culture than any other animal that we see in Middle-earth. And I don't know if it's Tolkien's intent here in this juvenile story intended to entertain primarily children, but there is something inconsistent. There is something incompatible with this compromise of the essential nature of the dwarves, right? Of the dogs is what I meant to say there. Because I'm thinking about the dogs walking on their hind legs, holding things with their forepaws and laying the table. There's nothing inherently wrong, I think, with the animals being treated as peers by Beorn. One of the ways in which we can see Beorn's echo rippling out through the Lord of the Rings in particular, I think is in Treebeard, right? It is no coincidence that it is around the time that we are introducing the very defiantly Anglo-Saxon culture of the Rohirrim that we are also simultaneously introducing the Shepherd of Fangorn Forest. And here we're seeing a similar kind of combination of Anglo-Saxon iconography, Anglo-Saxon language, right? We're getting more of that here, but we're also getting this idea of interconnectivity with one's environment, with a kind of stewardship position, right? I think it is clear that Beorn is taking a stewardship position, but we're left with dogs walking on their hind legs, which is not weird in and of itself. It is weird in and of itself, but it's not. The judgment does not fall upon this image because it is just strange. The judgment falls upon this image because it is antithetical to the kinds of morality that are presented to us through the rest of the legendarium. As I say, the people who seem to esteem animals the most invariably meet those animals where they are, right? It is a bad thing that Bill Ferny abuses his pony, and it is a good thing that Sam takes care of Bill the pony. But here we're transforming the dogs into a simulacrum, an incomplete simulacrum of human society. And I'm really, just invariably, just for the rest of my life, I am not going to be sure what to make of that. I don't know whether we're supposed to see this as being something good, whether we're supposed to see this as being like a surrogate society that Beorn has created for himself in the absence, possibly the grief-tilled absence of his other quote-unquote realer community, right? His kin, other people like him. I don't know what we're to make of it. I don't know if we're supposed to just write this off as being a cute bit of juvenilia, right? A little fairy tale side story here, or if we're supposed to be considering exactly what this tells us about Beorn's interactions with the world at large. I'm looking at the time, and I'm seeing now that we must delay no more. We must, in fact, get on to what I'm sure you've all been looking forward to the most this evening is the song. Of course, let's get to our second of these particular dwarf songs. Just like, I'll read it in just one moment, but I want to kind of anticipate here the meter and the rhyme scheme for you. Just like Far Over the Misty Mountains Cold from the first chapter, this song's meter is iambic tetrameter. It's 4 pairs of unstressed, stressed syllables. The wind was on the withered heath, right? Unstressed, stressed, 4 pairs thereof. And exactly like that first song, we get this, or the song from the first chapter, I should say, not the first song, which is distinct, but just like Misty Mountains Cold, we have this AABA rhyme scheme. We have the first, second, and fourth lines rhyming, and this internal rhyme that is culminated at the end of the third line. So we get the AAA, right? Heath, leaf beneath, and cold rolled mold in the second stanza there, with that third line internal rhyme, lay and day, groaned and moaned, harsh and marsh, and so on. It is structurally exactly the same song, and I want you to be thinking about how this... Okay, I want to call that one extra thing. This is structurally the same as Misty Mountains Cold, but it is structurally distinct from Chip the Glasses and Crack the Plates. So it is not the only song that dwarves can perform. It is not the only kind of rhythm and meter that dwarves can use, but it is consciously, I think, positioned as... I'll spoil this, right? The second of 3 times that we will see Misty Mountains Cold as a rhythmic structure assert itself again in the narrative. So let's take a look at this version of this song. The wind was on the withered heath, but in the forest stirred no leaf. Their shadows lay by night and day, and dark things silent crept beneath. The wind came down from mountains cold, and like a tide it roared and rolled. The branches groaned, the forest moaned, and leaves were laid upon the mould. The wind went on from west to east. All movement in the forest ceased, but shrill and harsh across the marsh its whistling voices were released. The grasses hissed, their tassels bent, the reeds were rattling on it went, o'er shaken pools under heavens cool, where racing clouds were torn and rent. It passed the lonely mountain bare, and swept above the dragon's lair. There black and dark lay boulders stark, and flying smoke was in the air. It left the world and took its flight over the wide seas of the night. The moon set sail upon the gale, and stars were fanned to leaping light. So, the Misty Mountains Cold song situates us historically first, right? We position the capsule history of the dwarves. We get when things were good, and then when things kind of went bad, and then in the third part of that song, we get the coming of Smaug, right? This is not a song that is about Smaug. It is not a song that is about the dwarves in the same way. It's not about the history of Erebor. This is something different. This is something that seems to be at least more immediately relevant, more contemporary to the experience that the dwarves are having right now. We start with this wind on the withered heath, but in the forest stirred no leaf, right? So the wind is on the heath, and that is why in the forest everything is still. And in that still, silent forest, their shadows lay by night and day, and dark things silent crept beneath. There is stillness within that forest, but the wind is coming. The wind came down from mountains cold, possibly crossing the misty mountains, right? And like a tide, it roared and rolled. The branches groaned, the forest moaned, and leaves were laid upon the mold. So the wind strikes or moves through the forest, and that stillness is dispersed. That stillness is dispelled. That stillness falls away. There are sounds now. There is life now. There is movement now. And the leaves fall from the trees to the soil below. The wind went on from west to east, continuing this journey. And of course, if you're coming to the Hobbit from the pages of the Silmarillion, that movement is extremely significant, right? From the west to the east. All movement in the forest ceased, but shrill and harsh across the marsh, its whistling voices were released. So now the wind has moved on past the forest. Now we have moved to the marshes, to the east of the forest. And there we're also seeing a kind of rise of life in response to this enkindling wind. The grasses hissed, their tassels bent, the reeds were rattling, on it went, o'er shaken pools under heaven's cool, where racing clouds were torn and rent. Right? So we're seeing now the wind moving on even further, past the marshes too. It brings life and action and restoration, renewal of a sort to this still, dank, silent forest. And then to the marshes too. It raises the marshes up in voice. It generates all of this sound from the grasses, their tassels bent, the reeds were rattling, and on it went. Then it hits the mountain. It passed the lonely mountain bare and swept above the dragon's lair. There black and dark lay boulders stark, and flying smoke was in the air. The wind presumably hitting the smoke like it has hit those racing clouds, torn and rent. Again, dispelling the darkness here, taking apart this thing that is foul, the black smoke above the lonely mountain. And then it angles upward. It left the world and took its flight over the wide seas of the night. The moon set sail upon the gale, and stars were fanned to leaping light. It doesn't just bring life to the forest or to the marsh or, a kind of restoration to the mountain. It then goes upward into the heavens, into the celestial spheres, and the moon takes sail upon that gale. The moon is moving because of that wind. The stars are fanned, right? Like a bellows at a forge. The stars are fanned into new and brighter leaping light because of the air that is moving past them, through them, with them. It is a fascinating piece of poetry, a fascinating piece of performance art for the dwarves at this point, because the thing that is missing from this understanding of this divine wind, this celestial wind, this Valerian wind, right? Is this the wind of Manwë that we are summoning up here? Silmarillion readers are certainly tempted to think so. I am certainly tempted to think so, right? If you hear of a wind coming out of the west, that's where you go. You go, oh, this is Manwë, seated upon Taniquetil, has decided to shake things up a little bit. But the positioning of the dwarves with relation to the wind, I think, is crucial and honestly somewhat enigmatic. Are they themselves the wind? Is this, right, to retrieve our long-forgotten gold? Is this them singing about their accomplishment as they move through? Did they come down from mountains cold, and like a tide it roared and rolled? Is this, metaphorically the encounter with the wargs and with the goblins here in Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire? Is there something symbolic here of the dwarves' own action? Or is this a recognition that something else is happening here, and the dwarves are being buoyed along by this wind in much the same way as the moon is, right? The moon set sail upon the gale, and also dwarves are carried by this wind from west to east, all the way to the lonely mountain, where they will disperse the rank black fumes and smoke of Smaug. I think it is an absolutely fascinating piece of poetry. And again, we're going to call this back a third time. The other thing I suppose I should mention in terms of that overall structure, anytime you see a triplicate structure in a piece of narrative, you are inclined to kind of read it as a three-beat. And I do think that we can functionally read this as a three-beat. We'll get to that when we return to the song later in the book. But certainly, even without that third recapitulation of this rhythm, of this rhyme scheme, of course we're invited to compare this moment to the unexpected party, because once again, all the dwarves have shown up. There's been a kind of the relaying of a tale, right? We've been told a story, and then we ate, and now they're singing. The dwarves are going to sing once more, and Bilbo once more is kind of going to be transported by that song in much the same way as he was before. They then sleep, and the next day, while Gandalf and Beorn are absent, the dwarves just rest. Bilbo wanders around a little bit. Gandalf returns and spends some time sending smoke rings around the pillars of the hall, right? Emphasizing that this is a civil place, emphasizing that this is a safe place, that it is not unlike Bag End itself. The return to blowing smoke rings and kind of enjoying that space certainly echoes Bag End again. They learn that Beorn has masked the bears the night before. All the bears of the area came out and danced, and then he led them off toward the Carrick. We get Bilbo sleeping again. In the morning, Beorn returns and is in good humor. Oh, I'll call out here. I didn't pull this on a slide because we simply have so much to talk about tonight. But this is the second time. When Bilbo returns, he comments on Bilbo's weight gain, right? Because Bilbo has been doing nothing but eating cream and honey and bread for 3 days at this point. And no wonder, after being so famished after their excursion beneath the Misty Mountains, he probably is putting on a pound or two at this point. But this is the second time in this chapter that Bilbo was explicitly referred to as a rabbit, right? Beorn calls him a little bunny, and the eagle previously called him a rabbit, which... We've talked before about the connections between Bilbo and rabbitry. Maybe I will do a more developed discussion of that over on the Sunday show for Shire Reckoning one fine week. I think that would be a really interesting thing to drop into. It's basically a discredited theory, I suppose. I don't think that anyone takes it too seriously, but there is enough there that if you want to believe that when Tolkien pulled that sheet of paper as he was famously grading essays, he turned that paper over and found it to be blank and wrote upon it, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. But what he actually wrote was, in a hole in the ground there lived a rabbit. If you want to believe that, there is some interesting supporting evidence. You kind of have to want to come in with that belief and then find, where to put your red strings on your corkboard. But there is some stuff there that kind of validates that theory. Let's get to, how many more slides do I have to go here? I think I've got 3 more to go and not much time to do it. So let's see what we can do to move through as we get to the end of this story. Now that Beorn has gone off and indulged in a little light torture, right? He has found this goblin, he has found this warg, and he has thereby confirmed the story that Gandalf told him. We can come back and he can meet them a little more honestly, meet them a little more directly here. "It was a good story, that of yours," said Beorn, "but I like it still better now I know it's true. You must forgive me not taking your word. If you lived near the edge of Mirkwood, you would take the word of no one that you did not know as well as your brother or better. As it is, I can only say that I have hurried home as fast as I could to see that you were safe, and to offer you any help that I can. I shall think more kindly of dwarves after this. Kill the great goblin. Kill the great goblin." He chuckled fiercely to himself. "What did you do with the goblin and the warg?" asked Bilbo suddenly. "Come and see," said Beorn, and they followed round the house. A goblin's head was stuck outside the gate, and a warg's skin was nailed to a tree just beyond. Beorn was a fierce enemy, but now he was their friend, and Gandalf thought it wise to tell him their whole story and the reason for their journey, so that they could get the most help he could offer. "The enemy of my enemy, because my enemy is now beheaded and stuck on a pole outside the gate." This is quite, I think, shocking, particularly if you're reading the semi-talking animals here in Beorn's home as being particularly juvenile. If you're reading them not as having any deeper meaning, but just as being an exercise in a kind of fairy tale whimsy here, if you're reading them as being not unlike the talking animals of Narnia, then I think that this comes as a very shocking moment and really underscores that idea that for all of his ostensible civility, for all of his ostensible courtesy, Beorn is still wild. There is a melding here, a union, a fusion here in the middle. Beorn then warns the party about the extended dangers of Mirkwood. Now that he knows where they're really going and what they're really trying to do, he tells them all about Mirkwood and then gives them bows and arrows and lends them a horse and ponies to carry them to the woodland gate. And the dwarves set out after one last meal. And I'll quickly scan this slide here of, geography of the area that we're moving through. As soon as they left his high hedges at the east of his fenced lands, they turned north and then bore to the northwest. By his advice, they were no longer making for the main forest road to the south of his land. Had they followed the pass, their path would have led them down a stream from the mountains that joined the great river miles south of the Carrick. At that point, there was a deep ford which they might have passed if they still had their ponies, and beyond that, a track led to the skirts of the wood and to the entrance of the old forest beyond. But Beorn had warned them that that way was now often used by the goblins, while the forest road itself, he had heard, was overgrown and disused at the eastern end and led to impassable marshes where the paths had long been lost. Its eastern opening had also always been far to the south of the Lonely Mountain and would have left them still with a long and difficult northward march when they got to the other side. North of the Carrick, the edge of the Mirkwood drew closer to the borders of the Great River, and through here the mountains too drew down nearer. Beorn advised them to take this way, for at a place a few days' ride due north of the Carrick was a gate of little-known pathway leading through Mirkwood that had led almost straight toward the Lonely Mountain. What is most striking here? Well, I guess, what is most striking here? Firstly, the marshes, right? There are marshes to the east of the forest road. Did the dwarves know about those marshes? It's not inconceivable that they did, because of course the dwarves know this area of old. They would have had a sense of the geography of those regions close to their, ancestral homeland here. But it is also possible that these marshes are a function either of the corruption of Mirkwood, more on that in next week's reading, or of the desolation of Smaug, more on that in like 8 weeks' time, right? But or some combination of the two, of course, that these marshes are not fixed geographical features, but are instead a product of the evil, the decay of this entire region, in which case the dwarves may not have known that they were there, but still they sang of them. The other striking feature here is that had the plan originally worked out, right? Had their passage through the Misty Mountains gone as planned, they would have come down into a road that they could not themselves use. Beorn had warned them that this way was now often used by the goblins, while the forest road itself, he had heard, was overgrown and disused at the eastern end. If the plan had worked out, they would have been in a much worse spot than they are now. We're getting this sense of ongoing good fortune, of ongoing luck, right? The luck of a widow's son, evident here again in the text. Chance you call it, evident here again in the text. Eucatastrophe, evident here again in the text. We must accelerate just a little because I do want to get to our last slide of the evening. So let's get to Mirkwood, and then we will conclude with Gandalf's farewell. Next day they started before dawn, though their night had been short. As soon as it was light, they could see the forest coming as it were to meet them, or waiting for them like a black and frowning wall before them. The land began to slope up, and it seemed to the Hobbit that a silence began to draw in upon them. Birds began to sing less. There were no more deer, not even rabbits were to be seen. By the afternoon, they had reached the eaves of Mirkwood and were resting almost beneath the great overhanging boughs of its outer trees. Their trunks were huge and gnarled, their branches twisted, their leaves were dark and long. Ivy grew on them and trailed along the ground.
"Well, here is Mirkwood," said Gandalf, "the greatest of the forests of the northern world. I hope you like the look of it. Now you must send back these excellent ponies you have borrowed."
The dwarves were inclined to grumble at this, but the wizard told them they were fools.
"Beorn is not as far off as you seem to think, and you had better keep your promises anyway, for he is a bad enemy. Mr. Baggins' eyes are sharper than yours. If you had not seen each night after dark a great bear going along with us, or sitting far off in the moon watching our camps, not only to guard you and guide you, but to keep an eye on the ponies too. Beorn may be your friend, but he loves his animals as his children. You do not guess what kindness he has shown you in letting dwarves ride them so far and so fast. Nor what would happen to you if you tried to take them into the forest." So, our introduction at last to Mirkwood, I will call that again, right? The silence of Mirkwood. As we approach the silence, the stillness of Mirkwood, just as the dwarves were singing earlier. I think that we're really encouraged by these details to situate the dwarves' song as being in the present of the action and almost emblematic of their own path through the eastern side of the wild here. So Mirkwood, obviously just an English word, right? Old English word, meaning the gloomy wood, but it has a number of different names, including Tar Nufuin, if you're familiar with Beleriand and our extended discussion over on Stars and Swords of the Silmarillion. You might remember the forest Tar Nufuin, forest under nightshade, forest under night, that we discussed back in Beleriand. It is also called Tar Nufuin. Mirkwood is also called Tar Nufuin. It is also, the Erin Lasgalen
Beorn, the wood of the green leaves, is here. Enengalan, which simply means greenwood, which is used a couple of times. And then Taur e Endalos is a Sindarin name. I don't think I'm pronouncing that correctly, but still. Forest of the Great Fear, which is glossed by Paul Strack, who really is fantastic when it comes to unearthing the meanings, to filtering and interpreting the meanings of these Sindarin phrases in particular, which the professor did not gloss for us. Okay. I'm moving a little more swiftly than I would like to, but we are just a few minutes away from the end of our session tonight, so I absolutely have to push on to our final slide and talk about Gandalf's farewell and what we can get from this. They camp one more night here in the fringes of the forest, and the following morning Gandalf departs with these last words of warning.
There are no safe paths in this part of the world. Remember, you are over the edge of the wild now, and in for all sorts of fun wherever you go. Before you get round Mirkwood in the north, you will be right among the slopes of the Grey Mountains, and they are simply stiff with goblins, hobgoblins, orcs of the worst description. Before you could get round it to the south, you will get into the land of the Necromancer. And even you, Bilbo, won't need me to tell you the tales of that black sorcerer. I don't advise you to go anywhere near the places overlooked by his dark tower. Stick to the forest track. Keep your spirits up. Hope for the best, and with a tremendous slice of luck, you may come out one day and see the long marshes lying below you, and beyond them, high in the east, the lonely mountain where dear old Smaug lives, though I hope he is not expecting you. Very comforting, you are to be sure, growled Thorin. Goodbye. If you won't come with us, you'd better get off without any more talk. Goodbye, then. And really, goodbye, said Gandalf, and he turned his horse and rode down into the west. But he could not resist the temptation to have the last word. Before he had passed quite out of hearing, he turned and put his hands to his mouth and called to them. They heard his voice come faintly. Goodbye. Be good. Take care of yourselves. And don't leave the path. Then he galloped away and was soon lost to sight. Oh, goodbye and go away, grunted the dwarves, all the more angry because they were really filled with dismay at losing him. Now began the most dangerous part of all the journey. They each shouldered the heavy pack and the water skin which was their share, and turned from the light that lay on the lands outside, and plunged into the forest. Minor curiosity in this slide is that this is the only original first edition use of the word orc in the entirety of The Hobbit. There are now a few more scattered through, but in the original first printing of The Hobbit, this was the only one kind of rolled up here with this specter of monsters to the north. So the Necromancer is conjured by Tolkien as a means of getting Gandalf out of the plot, right, and leaving the dwarves to their adventure. The story is already in the process of becoming a little more mature. It is becoming a little more grown up. Bilbo is taking on more aspects of the hero, or at least is about to, right? We're going to see him pass his first really traumatic trial once we're into Mirkwood itself. So the Necromancer exists as a means of getting rid of Gandalf, so it's not that important, right? It doesn't really matter who the Necromancer is to the original conception of The Hobbit. He's going to play no narrative purpose. So Tolkien just borrows from himself. In fact, in Tolkien's first pass, Dol Guldur, the Necromancer's fortress in southern Mirkwood, is intended to be Tol Engauroth, the former Tolsurian, the Isle of the Werewolves, later situated in Beleriand, but right now situated slap bang in the southern expanse of Mirkwood, right? The Isle of the Werewolves, where Beren and Finrod Felagund are imprisoned during the story of Beren and Luthien, where Finrod Felagund meets his final doom, unfortunately. This isn't part of the narrative schematic as Tolkien presents it, right? He's not really thinking through the consequences of this, the applicability of this, and obviously it changes over time, but it is fascinating that his first thought is to use Thu the Necromancer as introduced in the current version of the Silmarillion that he is working on at this point in history. Obviously, all of that is also later going to be revised, but he just copies his own idea for a cool spot that is like dangerous, like a bad guy. He just drags a bad guy out of the Legendarium and drops it into this book because it doesn't matter. The Legendarium, firstly, is never going to be published, certainly where he is in the preparation of The Hobbit. He believes that is the case. And secondarily, this is a children's book. This isn't a part of the Legendarium, so he doesn't have to worry about internal compatibility. That's why he can casually throw in Elrond and Gondolin and all of the trappings of the cosmology, the history of Arda is dropped into The Hobbit as backcloths, as stage sets, as stories within stories to provide depth and interest here in the pages of The Hobbit. And all of that, of course, is going to be particularly significant as we move into
our final discussion next week. Our final discussion. Of course, we have a long way to go. I'm thinking very much of this of Flies and Spiders, Chapter 8 of The Hobbit, as being really the end of the first part of The Hobbit, although I think maybe you can argue it is the end of the second part of The Hobbit. Exactly the structure of this novel is, again, kind of elusive, kind of difficult to pin down. Let me call up here. Oh, I guess I did not put click here to end the presentation. It's the end of the episode, you guys. So that's exactly where we are. I didn't put a schedule slide up this week, but that's okay, because I can just tell you next week we are going to be reading Chapter 8, Flies and Spiders. We're going to be looking at Bilbo's most perilous adventure to date, even including, Gollum and goblins. I think that Flies and Spiders gives us such a horrific, just monstrous perspective into what Mirkwood is and how the dwarves are going to navigate it, as well as being this really evocative kind of summation of the dangers of fairy. We're going to be playing with some of that too, and the deeper environmental corruption that we associate with forces of great evil here in Tolkien's Legendarium. That is going to do it for this episode of Shire Reckoning. Here I am, basically on time. It's all going to work out. But if you want more, head on over to patreon.com/nextword, which is where you will find, by the way, if you follow that page for free, then you will get every week the link to this live session. If you're listening to the podcast version after the fact, if you're watching this on YouTube after the fact, and you're wishing you were here among these estimable people to hang out and offer great comments as I'm moving through, I've been very, I've been ignoring the chat tonight, largely because I had so much ground to cover, and I'm very sorry for that. But you guys are all fantastic, and it's such a pleasure to have you all here with me. If you, dear listener at home, would like to be here for next week's session, head over to patreon.com/nextword, where you can sign up for free and get the links to these live sessions, or you can pledge a little financial support. You can send me the cost of, a cup of coffee or a pint of ale at the Green Dragon every month, and in so doing, you help me make more podcasts, but you also get access to the exclusive Patreon-only after show, Last Call at the Green Dragon, which I'm going to sit down and begin in about 15 minutes. So we're going to be picking up, I'm sure, on some thoughts on talking animals and Beorn and the positioning of this chapter in the book in terms of the narrative schematic, in terms of how we understand the push-pull of the hill and the mountain, the west and the wild. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk about Beorn so much with you all. As I say, Spiders next week, not an episode for arachnophobes. I'm not sure if any of you are unfamiliar with the content of that chapter, but the spiders are real gross. So we're going to be talking about them in some depth. So if that upsets you, then maybe skip out on next week and come back for Barrels Out of Bont. Come back for the Hall of the Elven King, the King of the Woodland Realm, Thranduil, as he is known in other textual sources. That's going to do it for Shire Reckoning this week. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for your support. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, take care. Good night, all.